Welcome back to the Donkey Vote podcast with Francis.
Tobias.
And George. These interviews will be focusing on the past careers of politicians before they entered parliament.
With a strong intention to our audience that anything is achievable no matter what you studied in university or college.
If you like this sort of content, please make sure you like, subscribe, comment, and share with your friends. Also, we are on YouTube and Spotify, so make sure you follow us on those platforms.
Make sure to follow us on Instagram as well to keep updated with the latest episodes and reels that we release.
Enjoy
the
the
interview.
Today we are joined by a member from New Zealand, a member from New Zealand National, Miles Anderson from Waitaki. I believe that's your electorate, isn't it, Miles?
That's right. Thanks for
Yes.
the introduction. But yes, so
Yes.
the Waitaki is an electorate in the South Island. It's reasonably big by New Zealand standards, probably average by Australian
Australian
standards.
standards, yeah.
I was talking with an ex-MP who was the representative of Rangitikei, which is in the central North Island, and I can't remember the name of the representative from West Australia who's got the biggest electorate in the
I think
world.
that was Melissa Price. She's got Durack, which is massive. I think it's probably bigger. It's probably like 20 times bigger than New Zealand itself.
Yeah. And so he said to me when he was talking with her, he felt he didn't need to complain about the distances he had to travel to get anywhere because she was having to fly from town to town.
It is quite a struggle, especially in those remote outback sort of electorates. But just speaking to yourself, Miles, could you give us a little brief description of yourself before we get into questions, and a little bit more about Waitaki, just because I'm going to assume a lot of our viewers may not know a lot about the South Island and your electorate specifically.
Okay, so myself, I guess my roots are in business and farming. When I left school, I actually did a stint in the public service in the Justice Department in Christchurch for 18 months. Actually, it was in what was called the Commercial Affairs Division of the Justice Department, which dealt with bankruptcies, um, liquidations, receiverships, and also all the company law and the various regulatory requirements that people were required to do around company law. And then I went off to university and I went to a university in the North Island at Massey and I did an ag degree. So I suppose it's a ag com, and it would be
Mm.
called nowadays. And then from there, when I left university, I sort of fell into a business, a startup that was um, using ultrasound technology, which was a new thing,
Mm.
to scan commercial farm animals.
Mm. Mm.
So that business started in 1992 and it took off really. I was I suppose, just lucky when and where it was. So I was the only game in town for a bit, and
Mm.
that allowed me to get quite a good customer base established. And over, a number of years, I had that business. I expanded that into South Australia and Western Victoria, actually, in
Mm.
about 96, I think.
Okay.
And which was good because my wife's from South Australia, so it gave us the opportunity to go back to Australia as a family every year for a number of years. Um, the town that she's from is a place called Murray Bridge, just
Yes,
out
Murray.
of
Yeah.
Adelaide.
Just about an
And
hour out of Adelaide, I think.
that's right. And
Yes.
I was doing quite a lot of work down in what they call the southeast, down in Western Victoria and also up in the mid-north in some of that station country up there.
Mm.
Quite good because the seasons in New Zealand and Australia complemented each other. Started in Australia in late January, early February, went through to May. The season in New Zealand was from May through to mid-September. And then when I wasn't doing that, I was working on the family farm and tied up on the family farm.
Mm.
In the early 2000s, we bought the family farm and expanded it a bit. And I continued with my business until 2013, I think it was. And I
Mm.
sold it. I'd sold the Australian part of it in the early 2000s when our our eldest was school age, so we
Mm,
sort of had to settle somewhere. We figured, and I sort of thought, well, I'll just focus on farming, and I was involved with our local federated farmers, which is a bit like your farmers union in Australia.
mm,
Missed a meeting and got given a job,
mm,
as happens in many cases. And so I ended up working my way through the provincial and then the national body. And I ended up spending 3 years on the national board
mm.
um, from 2017 to 2020, where we had a lot of, I was here in Wellington a fair bit with that job, and I had a lot of interaction with the bureaucracy and Parliament at the time. So the local member for Parliament announced her retirement in 2021. She was also a National Party MP.
Mm.
So I had a discussion with the family, and we thought, what the hell? Won't know unless you try. So I threw my hat in the ring and went through that candidate selection process before becoming the candidate, and then going through the general election last year, and
Here you
here
are.
I am. So
Exactly.
the white, yeah. So it's
Mm,
been, and it was nothing. I never grew up um, dreaming of being a politician. It's just sort of
mm,
happened.
exactly.
Yeah, and so the Waitaki electorate is, by New Zealand standards, as I said earlier, quite big,
Be-
and it's sort of got two distinct, or three really distinct industries. So on the western and southern end of it is tourism related. So I've got towns like Wanaka, um, Twizel, Tekapo, which are on the tourist route.
Mm,
So tourism are obviously big drivers of those local economies. Further inland from, well, probably east of Wanaka, there's quite a big horticulture, viticulture industry, a lot of wine, obviously, a lot of
mm,
stone fruit,
mm,
etc. in that area. And then the rest of the economy in the Waitaki relies on the agrarian economy, so sheep and beef and dairy
mm,
industry. And we do have, obviously, with a lot of shoreline, we do have a marine industry as well,
mm.
mostly crayfishing and
Okay.
some, well, blue cod is one of the bigger fish
Mm,
area, which is, I think it's a New Zealand native species that is good eating.
mm.
So it's quite diverse, and,
Yeah,
and the
it's
biggest
very
town I've
diverse.
got is Wanaka, which has a permanent population of around 13, 14,000. And then with it being a tourist town, it doubles or triples at least in
Mm,
size or more during the peaks of the tourist season, because they're in the middle of the ski fields in the central Otago, as well as it's very popular in summer. Obviously, lakes, etc. up there are big tourist
mm,
attractions. It's just over the hill from Queenstown.
mm,
Um,
mm.
and yeah, so I find that really fascinating, just the diversity of the
Yeah.
industries within. And we do have a bit of mining as well. There's a big
Mm,
gold mine at a place called Macraes, and there's potentially a few more gold mines that hopefully are going to spring up in the next year or two.
mm, mm. And it's very important to have that sort of diverse industry because, one of probably the big things in Australia is that we are quite reliant, probably too much sometimes, just on the mining and agricultural industry. And, you've got to diversify. And it's a good thing that your electorate there has a lot of diversification with tourism, mining, agriculture, horticulture, that sort of thing. So it's really important, I think, in across the whole nation in terms of their economy to have the most diverse sort of areas in terms of the economy, not just relying on one or two certain industries.
Yeah. And the Waitaki River, which runs through the top part of the electorate, is has several power stations on it. There was a big
Yeah.
hydro scheme that
Mm,
started in the 1930s and finished in the 1970s, early 80s, where there are seven power stations that generate a fair proportion of the country's electricity.
Mm,
Um, and, we sort of, as a nation, have been paralysed by fear of doing anything like that again for the last 30
mm,
years. But, our forebears had a lot of foresight
mm,
to bite the bullet and do that, because not only does it provide a lot of domestic and commercial water and electricity, but it also, the amenity values that have been, and the recreational opportunities that have been created are
mm.
fantastic.
Exactly, and we had a similar scheme as well in Australia with Snowy Hydro,
Yep.
around the southern part of New South Wales, and I know the previous Liberal government here was pushing forward towards Snowy Hydro 2.0, which was going to be a second section of Snowy Hydro um in energy. So it is a really really good idea that our forebears back in the 1930s and 40s, pre and post World War II really had the idea of coming up with hydroelectricity, seeing as it's in a really important way and probably one of the most efficient ways of creating electricity that's quite still renewable at the same time.
Yeah, that's right. And here in New Zealand, really, I mean, my Australian relatives always shake their heads and can't believe how much of our water that we have flowing, quite freely compared to parts of Australia, particularly South Australia, which is your dry
Mm, it's a
state.
very dry state.
Yeah, 98% of our water just flows out to sea.
Mm, which is
So
which is such a
we should
waste.
be, yeah, I know it is a waste. So our government has a plan around getting some of these schemes up and
Mm,
going in the renewable space, not just
yeah.
hydro, but solar and wind and geothermal. There's quite a bit of
Mm,
geothermal electricity generated in the central North Island. And the big, I suppose, barrier over the last, and it has been 30 years too, since we've done anything of national significance, has been a piece of legislation called the Resource Management Act, which has had successive governments and successive ministers drop pieces of legislation, or what we call policy statements, into the Act, which has made it really, really difficult to get anything done, because
mm,
every man and his dog is then allowed to have their opinion and take things to court and hold everything up in the
mm.
Environment Court forever, which has been the case for so many mooted schemes and infrastructure projects over the last 30 years.
And we've had similar cases in Australia as well, just thinking of the Franklin Dam scenario back in the 1980s and 90s. And that actually really started the green movement probably across the
Yeah,
whole world. So we've had a similar circumstance, with, protesting and stopping hydroelectricity, which, in my opinion, if we had the Franklin Dam at this point, energy across the whole country would have been far cheaper. And Tasmania's already reached net zero in terms of net energy because of how much hydroelectricity they're able to produce because of the natural river flows and streams that they have there. And I think we do have an underwater across the Bass Strait. We do have an underwater cable that connects the surplus energy from Tasmania to Victoria and other states.
yep,
But if Tasmania were able to produce even more electricity, I can't even imagine how much cheaper the electricity bills and electricity would be on the mainland.
yeah. And look, my view is that what can hold economies and societies back is expensive energy. And if we
Exactly.
can produce abundant energy cheaply for everybody, then the economy benefits,
Mm,
businesses are willing to invest. You have all these flow-on effects that aren't talked about enough.
mm,
And in New Zealand, we have traditionally had pretty cheap electricity, really,
mm,
except this year we've really run into a hole because we've had a dry hydrological year. Hasn't been that windy. You don't get a lot of sun in the middle of winter,
mm,
and our power prices have spiked well over $1,000 a megawatt only a month ago, which makes it difficult, particularly if you're living on a fixed income as a retired person or a retired couple.
mm,
So one of our, priorities is to deal with this and make it so that we don't have the same sort of thing happening repeatedly over the next few years. And what only saved our bacon really is there's a couple of big energy users that have cut back their use to allow more electricity to get into the grid. And
Mm.
that's all well and good. But of course, if they're not getting the energy that's in their contracts, then they have to get paid out. And so
Mm.
we're
Exactly.
paying for it one way or the other.
I totally agree with you there, Miles. So I think we'll get straight into our questions for you then, Miles. So
Yep.
my first question actually to you is, how was your high school and university life? I know you did briefly talk about this in your opening statements. But do you have any also memorable moments you'd like to share on the podcast, specifically about your high school university life?
So high school, I went to school in Oamaru. I was boarded actually at
Okay.
St. Kevin's was the name of the school,
Oh,
and I had a great time at high school. I was fortunate, I had really good teachers, and back in those days, you were expected to have a lot of extracurricular activities, particularly in the sporting fields.
mm.
I enjoyed that immensely. I wouldn't have had
Rugby and
those
cricket, of
opportunities.
course.
Yeah, rugby, cricket, tennis, lots of sports actually. Um, and uh, I wouldn't have had those opportunities had I'd gone from to school from home, because obviously I would have been relying on my parents for transport to and from
Mm.
various events, which it's not possible to do all that stuff. Particularly, I've come from a reasonably large family, and if everyone was doing disparate events, I mean, you'd have to be on the
Exactly.
road 24 hours as a
Every
parent.
day.
So, and look, I think one of the highlights amongst many was I was fortunate enough to play rugby for our first 15, and we played the curtain raiser in our annual school match with our crosstown rivals, to the last North Island South Island rugby match that was ever played. So every
Oh,
year there used to be a North Island South Island rugby match, and it was an annual event, obviously, and
yes.
was made. The teams were both made up of lots of All Blacks and very high-profile
Mm.
football players, and I was fortunate enough to play in the curtain raiser to the final North-South rugby match, which
Mm.
was at the
How,
time
how
you
old were
don't
you at,
realise it, but
yeah, how
it
old
was
were you at
quite
the
it was
time,
historic.
Miles? Was that high school, 17,
17.
17? Okay.
Mm.
Wow.
So that was cool. That's pretty cool when you
Mm.
look back on that. University, I just had ball at university. I really enjoyed it, probably too much, and my father would tell you.
Mm.
Um, but I think the best thing about it was I was in a different island at university, so
Mm.
I had to start from scratch, making most of my friends from school went to universities in the South Island.
Mm.
So I really went there not knowing anybody, and ended up making friends for life and getting to see a part of the country that I wouldn't have seen,
Mm.
parts of the country up there that I wouldn't have seen otherwise. So yeah, and again, I was fortunate enough to have pretty good lecturers when I was at university who, I'm grateful that, I had a lot of luck with the people that were teaching me throughout my life.
Mm.
Picked
Mm.
up hopefully useful things from them.
Yeah, hopefully,
Yeah.
I mean, you were able to set up your own agricultural business as you were talking about with ultrasound. So with ultrasound, so I'm gonna assume that they were quite helpful in that sense.
Yeah, and it was good. I mean, the business side of things that
Mm.
you probably you can still doing it without going
Exactly.
to university, but it certainly helped, and it's also helps when you're kicking off a business like that when you're younger.
Mm.
Is you're probably a lot more optimistic. As a person of my age, you probably become a bit more risk adverse.
Mm.
So I could do things that I probably wouldn't do as someone of my age now.
Mm.
So that was fun. And then I guess I had in between all that, I had time to. I did a bit of a jaunt around Europe for 6, 8 months with some friends, and I saw parts of Europe and the world that I wouldn't have seen
Mm.
otherwise. And, I spent quite a bit of time, ironically, in Ukraine.
Oh,
Just and it wasn't by design; it just happened that way. And
yeah.
and
Just a
I had the
typical
greatest
backpackers
time
trip
there.
sort of thing.
Yeah, and then we just sort of got adopted by a group of young guys our own age from Kiev when we were there, and they basically acted as tour guides for the
Oh,
3 weeks we were in Kiev. Took us to parties and God knows what, and it was it was fun, and but also
yeah.
really gave us a real insight into how things work over there because it was apparent to us even as young guys that it's very corrupt. It was just if you wanted to get out of trouble with the police, you had to bribe them. If you wanted to do this, you had to bribe them, and
Mm,
all those sorts of things that were foreign to us in New
mm,
Zealand because and Australia really that
mm.
sort of bribery is just not done.
Yeah, it just doesn't happen here at all. So there's a very big cultural difference. I've
Oh yeah,
personally I haven't been spent much time in Eastern Europe, but from what I've seen and what I've heard, there's a huge cultural difference. I guess probably from the stains of the Soviet Union and what that left on those countries
correct.
there. There's probably still a bit of corruption still involved in the government, which is quite sad to see. It really is.
Oh, it is. And the other thing that really struck me was their real black sense of humor. And if you look at Eastern Europe, it's been the highway for so many invasions over thousands of years, whether it's the Huns or the Golden Horde or Hitler or whoever, right?
Mm,
And so they have this black, dark sense of humor that I found fantastic. I really liked it
mm,
because I enjoy that sort of humor. And um, they have this, I suppose, acceptance of things that we probably wouldn't accept here,
mm.
anywhere else. And
Yeah,
that's inbred, right?
yeah. From passed down from generations to generations, sort of thing.
Yeah,
Yes.
yeah,
So
you know.
I guess, in the cultural landscape of Australia and New Zealand, those sort of things would never be talked about at all.
No, that's right. And over there, they just had this acceptance that if things were going well, something had to go wrong really quickly. Like they had that
Mm.
Murphy's Law, looking at
Yeah.
everything through Murphy's Law lens, which I found, yeah. And then when you look into their history, oh, brutal.
Mm.
Some of the things that happened, not only during wars, but certainly through Stalin's era and
Mm.
through the era of the czars and right through, right? So
Mm.
they've got every reason to have that somewhat tainted outlook, if you know what I
Exactly.
mean.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
I get what you mean there, Miles.
Mhm.
So actually moving on now to our second question, you did talk about this as well in your preamble. You were a farmer before you entered Parliament. Actually a profession that many Australian MPs that we've actually interviewed as well have. New Zealand and even in New Zealand and across Parliament, there's probably been a lot of farmers who have been elected. What is actually with farmers entering Parliament, and why do you think they are such strong representatives for rural communities across Australia, New Zealand, and across the world?
Well, I think it's because it's the variety of experiences that they have. I mean,
Mm,
farming is and living in rural communities, you
mm,
tend to be a little bit more pragmatic in your approach to things. I think you also tend to be have to be a little bit self-reliant and used to working within and with your community to achieve goals. So that's probably lends towards the political side, I guess, and also here in New Zealand, this particular parliament that I'm in now, we've probably got the highest amount of primary production
mm,
representation than we've had for 70 odd years. So we've got people from all parts of the primary industries represented in
mm,
parliament. So that's something that, as a rural-based MP, we're actively trying to make the most of that and get some more rules, regulations, laws that have a rural lens over them first introduced, because certainly over the last 6 years, the rural community feel like they've been probably
just
castigated
forgotten
a bit.
about and let
Yeah,
down
forgotten
by.
about and made almost a bit of a scapegoat for some of the
Mm,
things, particularly in the climate and environment space.
Mm,
So we're trying to get where we're wanting to see a complete change to that
exactly.
uh, attitude and that
Mm.
view. Mm,
Because it's important because you can't ostracize them at all because they are primary producers. They produce so much economic growth for Australia and New Zealand in both economies. They're so crucial rural communities and proportionally as well with the amount of population they have in those areas. They produce so much for our economy. So you can't chastise them and forget about them in terms of important key infrastructure, whether that be, delivering good roads and good highways for them, delivering like key hospitals and that sort of things.
that's right.
Because if you're like, it's a problem we have here as well. Like when you become so dependent on your main cities like Melbourne and Sydney or Auckland and Wellington in New Zealand, it just ruins the amount of economic growth you can produce from the regions, which is so crucial. And you got to have and young kids who grow up in the regions, they just don't see a future for them out there. So they move to the big cities, and it just the population growth in the big cities is you can't governments can't keep up with the amount of population growth. So you've got to try and make the regions more ad appetizing for young people, especially to stay there, and, have
Yeah,
families and help grow the economies in those small towns because those are the life those are the lifeblood of many countries across the world.
that's right. And here in New Zealand, over 80%, I think it's 80.9% of our export income comes from the primary industries.
Mm,
So that's a big chunk of, there's 70,000 downstream businesses that are tied up directly with farming in New Zealand and well, with primary industries in New Zealand. And then there's also 375,000 jobs that are directly related to the all those industries, downstream industries as well, which represents quite a big chunk of the working population in New Zealand. So I think it's easy to get two steps away from where the food and fibre and etc. is produced. But if you don't realise that what you're buying
mm,
at the supermarket actually was grown somewhere in the country, then I think we've got a problem as a country.
exactly.
We don't recognise that.
And that's a
Mm.
massive issue. It's a really massive issue now that people just forget about the regions in a sense. I
Yeah,
guess it's just the heavy reliance on metropolitan areas is it's disproportionately affecting the amount governments care about the regions because they
yeah, I
might say
agree.
they might say in a sense that especially like Labour they don't here in Australia they don't really represent many regional electorates, probably the same as Labour in New Zealand, and they don't see they don't see much of a vote winning pattern with helping out the regional areas, and they would rather target metropolitan areas where they can get some swing seats, and that's disproportionately affecting primary producers, as you've been saying.
Yeah, no, I agree with your analysis 100%. Yeah, and it's the same here in New Zealand, right? And in particular, Auckland being the biggest city by
Mm.
far, that's where the votes are.
Exactly.
And it's Auckland that determines the colour of the next government, right? So how
Really.
they vote depends. So obviously
Mm.
that's where a lot of the political work is done, and certainly governments uh, have been guilty of chucking lollies at um, the big city electorates
Mm.
to entice their votes. And
Mm.
of course, if they're chucking lollies there, they've got to be taking the money from somewhere else.
Exactly. Um, because I do remember watching the New Zealand election last year, and it was quite interesting to see a lot of very safe Labor areas, especially in West Auckland, which has historically been, very safe, Labor territory with a lot of South Asian migration in that area and
Yes.
they switched towards the National Party for the first time, which is quite incredible to see. So, sometimes even as well, if you're just targeting, the higher upper class areas in Auckland and you're targeting maybe inner city areas and you forget about the more marginalized and
Yep.
migrant communities in even in Auckland for itself, those areas can vote against you and they can send you back into opposition.
Yes, right. And you're quite right. And that was a good example of the last election. And those areas, probably the message around law and order was a big one that swung the vote there because um, the previous government sort of had a catch and release policy with criminals, and it led to big social issues in those areas. I mean, ram raids and robberies and violent assaults, etc., were becoming commonplace, and the previous government's answer to that was is to, you know, put in smoke cannons
Mm,
in convenience stores to stop the robberies rather than dealing with the root cause, and people got very sick
mm,
of that very quickly, you know.
exactly.
Mm,
Yeah, and that's quite understandable because, you're not really dealing with the substance of the issue. You're just, trying to find a quick fix when in
that's right.
reality, it's all about, actually delivering more police officers, which, Labor, which I saw Labor, I saw some reports that Labor were spreading some misinformation around police numbers and that sort of thing in the last couple of months. But it's about actually providing substantial change and not coming up with cheap solutions to solve these big problems.
Yeah, and it's quite interesting because they have scored a number of own goals in the last, particularly around law and order stuff, and which is good for us because they've been asking questions in the House relating to the likes of the crime statistics and the number of police, and they've been way off and have made themselves look pretty silly over that. So,
Mm,
but it doesn't. We're still resolving us to the fact, that we definitely implementing different policies around this stuff because it was an election promise. Two, we see it as a big problem. If you don't feel safe in your own community, um, that has obviously all sorts of impacts socially, mentally,
mm,
all those things. So
exactly.
we want the victims and potential victims of crime to be first rather than those that the perpetrators of crime
Mm.
who tend to have been the focus of legislation over the last few years.
Exactly, exactly. And we're up to our next question for you, Miles. And you did previously talk about this in your preamble again. But prior to Parliament, you founded, as you said, a livestock ultrasound scanning service, which is now expanded into parts of Australia, as you said, I think in around the South Australia and Western Victoria area. How important is livestock to the New Zealand economy? And what was the process of creating this and founding this ultrasound service?
Well, livestock really important, and as I said earlier, 80% or just over 80% of New Zealand's export incomes derived from primary production, and that includes forestry and fishing and everything else from the land, horticulture, etc.
Mm,
And look, New Zealand's had, particularly in the sheep industry, has had a shrinking, I'd say you'd call it, of the national flock by a
mm,
significant amount. So when I started my business back in 1992, we had something like 40 something million breeding sheep in New Zealand, and plus the lambs and other non-breeding animals that added up to close to 50 million. We're now down to 15 million breeding sheep,
mm,
and with all the others, it would be lucky to make 20 million in total.
mm,
And we are at a crossroads for the sheep industry here in New Zealand. I think we are in a position where our uh, meat companies that are supposedly selling our products offshore have become a bit lazy with our marketing.
mm,
And what's happened there is we've relied too much on China as a place
mm.
to sell our product, and
Very same here. It's the same here as
what
well.
our yeah. So what our government is intent on doing is opening up new trade agreements in Southeast Asia because it's right next door. As you know, in world terms, it's just a stone's throw away, and
Exactly.
there's 300 just in Southeast Asia, not counting India or any parts of China. There's 350 million people under the age of 35, and they're
Mm,
growing. Um, I suppose they're becoming more upwardly mobile, so they've got a few more dollars in their pocket. So that's an area that this government is focusing on. Also, India, obviously, it's
mm,
got huge potential there. So the livestock industry is a huge driver of the economy, and it's certainly an enormous number of downstream jobs that come from our livestock industry. So our beef industry has been fairly stable, and things are looking good for the coming year for beef. Our dairy industry is what drives our farming industry. Um, I think dairying makes up. I've got to. I think they make up close to half of our primary production exports, or
mm,
a bit over. They also they buy, for example, my farm. I was a sheep farm, but I also grew crops, and most of my grain went to dairy farms, and they'd use that through their shed systems um, to increase production, obviously. So, big driver of our industry.
mm.
Um, yeah, I'm not, as I said, I'm a little bit concerned about our sheep industry. It's sort of dropped below the critical mass that's required to keep the
Exactly.
infrastructure that we have going. So it'd be interesting to see what happens. I'm a bit, well, I think there will have to be some meatworks that rationalise, they call it,
Generalize.
but shut down over the next year or so. And here, when that happens, it's the supplier that really pays for that because it costs
Mm,
money to shut these plants down. So to pay for it, they generally pay less for the animals that they're killing. So
mm,
um, because our industry is dominated by two players, really. One's called Silver Fern Farms, and
mm,
they're a sort of a hybrid cooperative corporate ownership model. And then there's Alliance, and they're straight out cooperative. And
mm,
Alliance lost $100 million last year, and
mm.
Silver Fern Farms lost 30, 40, something like that.
Yeah.
And so they're in trouble.
They are. So as people say, there's more sheep is such a critical industry to New Zealand itself. And, there's a lot of people joke around and saying, there's more sheep in New Zealand than actually people, like 4 times more. So,
Yeah, and it used to be
it's
a bigger number, right?
exactly. And it's dropped down, which is really, really, as we said, live exports are such an important, and, um, those
Yeah,
sort of industries are so important to New Zealand's economy. So, if
that's right. And
sheep are dropping down in population, it's going to detrimentally affect how New Zealand can, export and sell to across the world.
yeah, how we exactly. And the other problem we have here is the countryside. A lot of New Zealand's countryside lends itself best to sheep farming, like
Mm,
cattle. There's some pretty fragile soil types and stuff that cattle aren't too gentle on because of their size.
mm,
Um, and so there's the added concern that I have around the environmental impact of removing sheep from the landscape and replacing them with something else. And up and down the country, there's certainly been a number of sheep farms that have um, been planted out
mm,
entirely in forests, particularly for carbon forestry,
mm,
which there's no future in doing that really because the carbon credits only last for so long, and then the land's really hard to. Well, it's just our settings would be as such that that land would take a lot of money, and you have to get a lot of local consents and consents from the environment court, etc., to take that land away from pine production back into farming. So,
mm,
and then the problem being is that a lot of our little communities up and down the country have lost people.
mm.
And so the local schools shut, the local shop shut, the local pub shut. Um, there's the death in some areas of their rural communities.
Mm,
So that's something that we want to address as well as a government, because it's all well and good planting all these farms out and pine trees for carbon credits, but the long-term impacts and what's going to happen um, for New Zealand to earn its income in the future is severely compromised.
it really, really is there. And to touch on the second part of the question as well, what was the actual process around actually making your ultrasound service company?
Oh,
Was
right,
there?
yes.
Yes.
So what happened was is local three or four farmers had been reading a British farming magazine, and the
Mm,
technology had only really been going for 12 months in the UK.
mm,
The technology that made it possible to do it with farm animals anyway. And it's really quite, I don't want to get into the technicalities of it, but so they thought, well, we should see if we can do it. And basically, they um, said to me, oh, do you want a job? And
mm,
I said, oh, what the hell? And so that was interesting because I'd no one to teach me or anything like that. So the way I taught myself was I was going from farm to farm to train myself, scanning the dog tucker mobs for the farmers, and then I'd knock the dog tuckers over and see what was inside the sheep. Um, and then 18 months later, I bought the business off the original investors, and including myself, who was an original investor, and
mm,
then expanded it. So in New Zealand, I had a couple of rigs going, plus I was getting contractors in to do the overflow work as well. And then in
mm,
Australia, we thought, oh, well, we'll have a crack over there as well because the seasons were complementary, and it'd be a good chance for Kim, my wife, to get back and see her family. And
mm,
so it was, but, the optimism of ignorance, I guess,
mm,
that was driving it. So we took it over to Australia, and I demonstrated at a number of shows up at Karoonda and down in the southeast at the Lucendale show. That is a big, big show that's held every year. And word of mouth, I became really busy. And so it worked out very well for us. And then, as I said, when my oldest got to school age, we made the decision to sell the Aussie business, and
mm.
a local guy bought it. And as far as I know, he's still running it over there.
Ah,
Um, and in 2013, we've done 21 years or whatever, 22 years in New Zealand, and I felt it was time for a change, and I sold my business to a local guy, and he's still running it as well.
mm,
And I guess, there's always a bit of luck in these things. And
mm,
as I said, I was started off, there was 40 something million sheep, and now there's only 15 million breeding sheep. And so I probably hit the peak,
mm.
really, and
Yeah.
kept me busy, busy. So I was in New Zealand, I was doing quarter of a million sheep a year.
Oh, wow.
And we were running them through a handling setup where we were identifying the ewes that were carrying singles, carrying twins, carrying triplets, those that were barren. And then that enabled the farmer to make some pretty good economic decisions. They could get rid of their barren ewes early, so they weren't feeding them through the winter or through
Mm,
the harder period to feed during the year. They could feed their multiple carrying sheep better quality and a bigger amount of feed so that they got a higher survival rate out of their lambing. And they
mm,
could, I suppose, adjust the feeding ratios to their single carrying ewes so that they weren't getting over fat and having trouble trying to lamb when lambing came. So it made economic sense for the farmers to utilise that technology.
mm,
And in Australia, I was doing 100,000 odd sheep a year,
mm,
and that's just be interesting to go back and see how my business is doing now. I think it
now
just took a little bit longer to
to
take
get
off
started.
over there,
Yeah, but
but I had no
mm,
doubt, I had a lot of confidence that it would get up to a couple of 100,000 pretty
mm,
soon.
hopefully.
So
Um,
yeah,
yeah. It's our sheep industry here from what I can tell is probably not as big as yours in New Zealand, in terms of, proportionally, the amount of sheep that we produce here. It's, a lot of cattle, a lot of
yeah,
dairy here, which is a bit bigger than our sheep industry. But I'm probably going to assume like the business probably has taken off because it's a really good initiative to see, as you said, it helps farmers economically, proportionally, like, decipher how much feed they're able to give to each sort of lamb, and being able to make more better and informed decisions, because at the end of the day, if if one of the lambs can't produce their foal correctly,
yeah.
what's the point of actually feeding them at that point? And it might be better to put them up for the slaughter than actually just keeping them around if they can't produce any
Well, that's right. And also, since then, in the early 2000s, Australian farmers had more of a focus on meat production than
yeah.
they had in the past. So I have no doubt that most farmers over there will be utilising the ultrasound technology on sheep farms,
Mm,
um, simply because it makes economic sense. Um, it's money well worth spending because you get a return that's at least 10 times what you've invested.
mm. It really, really is. And at the end of the day, with farmers and with sadly with a lot of agricultural products, and um and wheat and barley and these sort of things, and feed, there's not enough of it to go around, so you've got to make those sort of informed decisions to be able to economically output as much as possible in the
Yeah,
farming industry.
yeah, and just there's efficiencies with it as well. So,
Exactly.
and originally when I started for the first 3 or so years, I was scanning cattle as well.
Oh, okay.
But for
Was
me, because I started focusing in Australia, the seasons clashed for me here in New
mm,
Zealand. So I got out of that, and
mm,
I was also scanning deer.
oh,
And the same thing, the deer season clashed with the sheep season in New Zealand. So
mm,
it sort of ended up just specialising in one group of animals, really. And I
mm,
had colleagues that were just focusing on the deer industry, and other guys
okay.
that were doing the cattle and sheep in New Zealand. But since I was in Australia as well, I just focused on the sheep side of things in
Mm,
the end.
mm,
Did get the
mm.
odd um, friend and relative who happened to be pregnant wanting me to scan them as well. And I was quite happy to just give them the gear. I'd
Mm,
tidy, clean it up first, obviously, give them the gear and let them scan themselves. I was terrified that I might see something that, an abnormality or something, and I'd be
mm.
the one that had to tell them. So I said, yeah, you have the machine, here's the gear, you scan yourself, you can uh, work it out, but I don't want to be in the room.
Exactly. You don't
Yeah.
want to be part of that sort of process.
No, because when my wife was pregnant, we scanned.
Mm,
She, obviously was in the room then,
mm.
but the
Yeah.
friends and family and stuff, no, no, didn't want to do that. That was a doctor's job.
Would make a total lot of sense there. Total lot of
Yeah,
sense, yeah.
yeah,
So moving on now to our next question, Miles. As you said as well, you were the chair of the Federation of Farmers for New Zealand from 2017 to 2020. What sort of work did you conduct while being chair, and what are some of the initiatives that you started that you were proud of starting?
right. So I was the chair of the meat and wool industry group, which then gave me a seat on the board of Federated
Mm,
Farmers. Um, and there was a few initiatives that we started. One was around livestock rustling. We
mm,
worked with the an MP who was the member for Rangitikei, who I talked about earlier, on getting some of the law changes, because essentially, if you were rustling livestock off private property, the penalties were minor. And if you happen to be on the other side of the fence on Crown property rustling, you got the book thrown at you. So
Mm,
um, we wanted some parity around the sentencing and how it was treated because livestock rustling in New Zealand is like $120 million problem annually.
mm,
And so we got a law change around that. So I was really thrilled about that. My role as the chair of the meat and wool industry group was quite varied. So you have obviously meat and wool specific issues, and we
mm,
had a national executive, etc., and we'd have regular meetings yearly, two every year, plus with the advent of modern technology, we're able to have Zoom meetings
mm,
monthly with various sectors of the meat and wool industry group. But also on the board, you have portfolios that you're allocated. One of mine was electricity, the other one was rural security and firearms stuff. And of course, in 2019, we had the mosque shootings in
mm,
Christchurch, and the firearms stuff took over my life for more than 6 months. That was pretty much what I was doing for 6 months, and that was an interesting experience, really. And we obviously, as the lead on that, when we were putting submissions to government, I was uh, doing that along with the policy advisors, etc., that were
mm,
working for feds at the time. So that gave me a really good insight into
mm. Into politics
that
itself
part
at
of
that
how
point.
government worked.
Mm,
And then the rural security stuff was we were running. We joined hands with the police and the biggest insurance company that deals with farms. Farmers Mutual is the name of it, and we were running workshops all around the country on how to reduce the incidents, if you like, of crime in the rural areas, and more particularly how individuals could protect themselves
mm,
um, from being a victim of crime,
mm,
particularly in that it was more to do with robberies and poaching, and the big one at the time was also the meth labs that were springing up in the rural areas to that the gangs were renting the odd house here and there and um, putting meth cooks in and getting their meth cooked up,
mm,
which I know is a problem everywhere in the world, and I know in rural Australia, the what you call lice over there, don't you?
mm.
Yeah, it's a
It's a
problem
massive
over there.
problem.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So the yeah, the that was really interesting. That kept me busy because we'd have a board meeting every second month. You'd have to be in
Mm.
Wellington. I'd be up in Wellington probably every second week anyway because I had
Oh
meetings
wow.
with various people and whatever. So it was pretty much a full-time job done at a voluntary rate.
Mm,
But I really enjoyed that too.
mm,
And so that was really good background for what I'm doing now. Just networking
mm.
and working with other individuals and groups,
Exactly.
etc., to try and come to a consensus over how to deal with a certain issue or
Mm.
all those things. And
Yep.
Federated Farmers is a straight out rural advocacy group. We don't do any science or anything like that. We're just rural advocacy. We have
Mm,
levy bodies like beef and lamb or the dairy industry body or the deer industry body that they get a levy from your milk or your meat, and
mm,
they set up to do more along the lines of R&D and extension,
mm,
to take the R&D that they've done and take it to the farm, or to the farmers, and show them how this could work on within their farming systems,
Mm,
all
mm.
that sort of stuff. And also trade access is what the levy bodies do as well. So
Yeah. Yeah.
we've
Quite a
had,
different, yeah,
yes,
quite a
clearly
mix of different
defined
sort of roles
roles.
to
Yeah,
compound in that industry, which is, as you said, communication is important, and networking is very important in politics. So at least with that role in the Federation of Farmers, it was really helpful for you to to improve those sort of skills, and that's the sort of stuff that you're going to be doing right now as a member of Parliament, representing your local community, being able to network with business leaders, small businesses, farmers, and being able to communicate with them around the issues that they want to address within your local
that's right.
community.
And, I learned quite a few lessons, I guess, and you certainly see it over the years in politics anyway. I think best way to represent your people is, well, first you've got to get out and about and hear what they have to say. But secondly, is you've got to be yourself, be genuine, I think, and
Mm.
because it's pretty easy to tell when someone's been fake, isn't it? And I
Yes.
think I think some politicians think that they have to
Mm.
be a certain way and act a certain way rather than just
Being
being
genuine and honest,
themselves. Yeah, and
which is a big problem because the distrust you're seeing across the board with governments really goes back to that fact that politicians are just you know doing whatever they think is the best way to win votes, when in reality they sometimes don't really believe what they're pushing for. So, and people can see through that. People can see through that that those
that's
lies
right.
and not being genuine. So I think a lot of people really just hope that politicians are, at the end of the day, you are representing your local community, so being active and being able to network and communicate, as we said previously, is so important to being a
Yeah,
genuine politician.
and then I think using the information that you get from people, or the feedback you get from them, making sure that that information is filtered back up the line. In my case, as a backbench MP, the only way I can get um, anything changed is if I can convince a minister that such and such a policy needs to be introduced, or such and such a policy needs to be changed, or all those sorts of things. And the more people you hear from around a certain issue,
Mm.
the more forthrightly, I suppose, you could advocate on their behalf.
Exactly. Yeah, the more, I guess, the more you advocate for things and actually hear, people's perspectives from your local community, the more you're able to bring it to Parliament, bring it to, party room meetings, that sort of thing,
That's right.
and advocate for it better because you fully understand the issue that, that's a part of your local community because, you see it with your people every single day.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. And that's a fun part of the job, actually. I,
Mm,
I enjoy meeting with people of and I'm not just saying people that agree with you because
mm.
yeah, a lot of
And
people
still
don't
part of the
agree.
electorate who didn't vote for you as well, Miles. So,
Correct. So, I'm not there to represent the people that just voted for me. I'm there to represent everybody. Yeah,
so even listening to the people who may have not voted for you and listening to their concerns is still very, very important.
that's right. That's right. And
Yeah.
I'm very aware that some politicians, if they've been there for a bit long, tend to, seek their own advice rather
Mm,
than rather than seek advice or opinion from or the view of the electorate that got them there in the first place. And
exactly.
I don't want to be one of those people.
Mm, mm. Yeah, it'd be a bad role to have if you were one of those sort of people that just stopped
Mm.
listening to their own community and just thought about your own political career. That's when
Yeah,
that's when you lose the actual thought of what politics really is about at the end of the day and
that's
representing
right. And
people.
I was told by many politicians that you quite often look back to your maiden speech to see what your motivations were, and bear that in mind when you're on your journey in Parliament, because really you don't want to lose touch with the reasons why you
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 joined
got
up
into Parliament in the
and you
first
got
place.
elected. Yeah. We've got three questions left for you, Miles. So, my third last question to you is: who would you say is your political role model or idol?
Yeah, and I've thought about this, and I really don't have one particular role model or idol. I think a number of politicians from a variety of countries have parts of what they've done have been quite impressive. I always look at uh, President Eisenhower in the States, who was the commander of all the Allied forces in Europe and
Mm,
had an incredible military career, and then became president of the States in a time of boom, I suppose you'd call it. But shit, he put all the roads in that they still use today.
mm,
Massive network of roading in the States. Um, he was a fascinating guy, and when he was his final address, he was warning the population about the military industrial complex, etc., which is interesting because he's a military man. Churchill always comes up in great quotes, doesn't he? I mean,
mm,
quotable politicians, and Winston Churchill's always one of them. You've got, yeah, here in New Zealand, old Richard Seddon, who was the premier from 1890 something through to early 1900s. Um, Aussie's got, interesting politicians as well. I thought John Howard had some
mm,
um, pretty good policies and worked pretty effectively as the Prime Minister
mm,
for Australia. Um, we've been probably blessed until recent years with American presidents. If you
mm,
go through the history of American presidents from date dot,
mm.
so many of them have been atrocious. And it
Yes.
wasn't really until about around the Second World War, right through till recent years, that
Yes.
we've been even the worst, what some people regard as the worst president, which was Nixon. He
Yeah.
actually was a pretty good president. He just did one
Mm,
stupid thing. Um, and then in recent years, you've had, unfortunately, in America for Obama, he was a lame duck president, really, because the um, Republicans controlled the lower houses.
mm.
Um, then, God, I don't know how to describe Donald Trump, but he's,
He
he's not
not
good.
one word doesn't fit in for him. There's just too many emotions.
Yeah, and any other politician that was as brash and as attacked the messenger, and didn't really have a message and was so boastful,
Mm,
wouldn't have a chance anywhere else. But
exactly.
it's just that just currently in America, at the current environment over there, he's yeah, he's just unbelievable, really. And look, he has a very good chance of becoming president
President,
again.
yeah.
As a trading nation, I'm very, very aware of his, um,
Protectionist sort of style of
yes, his
politics, yeah.
protectionist and his ability, his willingness to dump tariffs on anything and everything that moves. And I also recognize that because of the United States Navy, the oceans and the trade routes have been safe since the Second World War. I
Mm,
don't think people realize that piracy before the Second World War was commonplace,
mm,
particularly in Southeast Asia.
yeah.
And he had been withdrawing American military from around the world, and a lot of what I'd call left-leaning politicians were cheering that. But for me, I felt America had done a very good job maintaining the world trade routes, and because
Mm,
of that, New Zealand's benefited.
mm,
Um, so I don't know what's going to happen, and
mm.
I don't even think Trump knows what's going to happen if he wins.
Exactly.
So, um, and then you've got, on the other hand, you've got the Democrats, who are a mess as well. I mean,
Mm,
Kamala Harris is not set the world on fire as the vice president. She
Mm.
certainly had one job, and that was the border, and she did a terrible job of that. So, I mean,
You're picking between the lesser of two evils at that point.
I think I don't know, and look, we'll see in the
How
lead
it
up to
goes.
the American election how
Mm.
divided the
Yeah.
country becomes.
Mm.
But that's the thing I don't like. I don't like that divisive type of politics. I think there's certain things you want to make sure that you are pointing out to the electors that you have a difference with other parties or whatever, but that total divide that America's got at the moment,
Mm.
it's going to take a pretty amazing politician to heal that rift.
Mm. It really is, and it's systemic now because it's probably been there for like the last 8 years or so. So it's and not you can't really have and really in America not really like the parties both don't have a very big control of the House of Representatives with the Republicans and the Senate with the Democrats.
Mm.
So it's so marginal that a couple hundred or a couple thousand votes really decides who's in power of what. So it's so split 50-50 down the middle that it's really going to be hard to see how the country can come back together. And I guess that's one great thing that we have about probably Australian and New Zealand politics at the current moment is that it's not as divisive as, it is in the US where it's 50-50 split. And, at the end of the
No,
day, even in Australia, we're able to the Liberal Party and Labor Party are still able to work together on legislation. And that's probably the similar case as well in New Zealand with being able to work together. And in America, from what I've seen, it's just so difficult to work together on that sort of legislation just because there's these probably the far left and the Democrats and the far right in the Republicans just aren't willing to work together and come to common ground.
no, and look, let's just hope that it's not a contagious type of politics.
Mm,
But
yes,
who knows? But we'll see what happens anyway. So
we really
that's
will.
that's interesting.
Mm,
But I've been over the years, done I read the histories of lots of presidents. And God, some of them just awful, awful, awful presidents.
like the
We think it's just a modern phenomenon.
Yeah. Was it Herbert Hoover and those sort of people back in the day?
Before him, Hoover wasn't a bad president, really. He just wrong time. I mean, he had
Mm,
depression, and I don't think it wouldn't have mattered who was president when the depression hit. They were going to lose the vote next time around anyway.
mm, yeah.
He wasn't bad. It was like the president from 1920 to 1921, or 21 to 22, whatever his name was.
Yeah.
God, I can see his face. Hopeless. And there was so much corruption under his presidency, and he only really saved himself because he died in
Mm.
office.
Harding, wasn't it?
Yeah, Warren Harding, that's it.
Yeah.
And then before him, Woodrow Wilson was a bigoted. Um, so you go right all the way back. There's some awful presidents, but
Mm. Yeah, it's quite interesting because you got Teddy Roosevelt of the world, and even FDR, even though he was very left wing, delivered a lot of great things for the US in and really helped, Allied forces, especially in the
correct.
Pacific.
And
So
people forget that America as a nation didn't want to have anything to do with the war in Europe as far as they're concerned. It was,
mm,
and even though the Japanese were all around Southeast Asia at the time, and he worked out a workaround or loopholes to help the Allies.
which is so important. And he really
Oh,
helped towards the end of World War II at that stage. If it wasn't for the US, we us two probably wouldn't be standing here and sitting here and talking to each other at this point.
well, we might be, but it might be in Japanese. You know, know what I mean? Because
Literally, yeah.
yeah, so
All right.
and you're a fool if you don't learn those lessons from history, I think, and
Mm,
also don't have the rose tinted glasses on when you're looking at some of that stuff. You've got to look at the good stuff that we did and the bad stuff that we did and all those sorts of things. And but yeah, it's
Mm.
fascinating.
Yeah, as they do say, history does repeat itself sometimes. So you got to
Yeah,
at the end of the day, just be prepared for history repeating itself. And you know, history could be repeating itself again if Trump gets elected and the as you're seeing in Europe, I think in Eastern Europe, you know, the rise of the AfD and those really strong, you know, quite far right sort of parties, you know, getting bit high of a vote share, especially in, you know, some parts of Europe.
yeah.
It's
And look, I think that's directly related to how poorly the refugee and migrant thing's been handled in Europe. And
mm,
look, when you're getting that many people coming to your country and you don't have the resources for your own people, and you're expected to provide all of these resources, you can understand people um, losing faith with the governments that are promoting that sort of thing. So um, I think in Europe, they've got a long way to go before they get to anywhere where they can have an agreement on migration in particular.
mm,
And of course, what's happened too in some places where you have big migration of a totally different culture, and there's that culture clash that happens with it.
mm,
Um, so I don't know. I mean,
yeah,
Kiwis and Aussies used to be go to the UK on their OE,
yeah.
and we'd get all the jobs that now Eastern Europeans are doing.
Mm. So it's just it's a massive sort of it's yeah it's a big systemic change there. And in my opinion as well, if you're from what I've seen, if you're you know coming from a migrant group and you just conglomerate within your own migrant group, you know within Australia and New Zealand, it's not necessarily healthy to the multicultural societies that we live in because at the end of the day, you have to communicate and work with different cultures because you can't just stay within your own cultural group within one
Yeah,
country. And it's not healthy
I
at all.
think yeah, I think assimilation is really important, and
Mm.
particularly for the next generation, like the kids that are born from, because they're sort of caught between two cultures. Then, like they're going to
Exactly.
school, and this is where they're having trouble in Europe, I think. But
Mm.
anyway,
Yeah. We'll see how it
there,
also
but
we'll
the
see how it
grace of
goes.
God goes us, eh? So
Exactly.
yeah.
Yeah. We'll move on to our next question then for you, Miles. So, um, talking about the election last year, what made you run actually in the 2023 New Zealand election for the National Party? And what made you join the National Party? And did you ever really consider maybe joining a different political party outside of National?
Yeah, well, I guess talking about Winston Churchill, he always said if you weren't liberal, and I don't mean a liberal politician, but liberal in your views, when you were 20, you didn't have a heart. If you weren't, you didn't have a heart. But if you weren't conservative in your views when you were 30, you didn't have a brain, which I think is a great quote. Um, so essentially, you look at the values and the policies of a party, well, particularly the values of a party, and it's sort of if you 80 plus percent, if you line up on those
Mm.
things, then that's your party,
Mm.
whether you like it or not. And I guess the values that the National Party have are values that I agree with. What made me run, I suppose, was I was really frustrated with the government we had at the time. I was frustrated with the treatment the business and rural communities were getting. I felt we were being scapegoated for a lot of stuff. I think we were also being treated like we were money banks,
Mm.
that had endless amounts of money, and any time the government wanted some money, they could just tip us upside down, shake us, and all this money would fall out of our
Exactly.
pockets. I was frustrated with the endless amount of regulation that was being chucked at us, where so much so where we were spending hours and hours and hours a week doing paperwork to satisfy some regulatory environment where,
Too much red tape.
yeah, and it wasn't achieving anything. It didn't, So that's was my motivation, really. I just thought, you can sit back and complain about something, or you can put your hand up and have a go. And so,
Mm.
well, that's my attitude anyway. So,
Mm.
that's what I did, and yeah, it was a
Now you're here.
wild ride.
Mm, mm. And talking about giving it a go and giving these an opportunity, what's some advice you'd give to students actually in 2024, especially those who are probably in the middle of their university education and the middle of completing and starting high school?
As far as politics or
Really
what
anything, just
advice?
in general.
Well, I think a lot of people, the expectation is that you're going to follow your passion and have this job, that every part of it is fantastic, and
Mm,
every job has parts to it that are miserable, that aren't that flash. And
paperwork.
yep, and other parts you might not like, but you've got to realize that a job that you finally get may not be perfect, but it might set you up on a career path to your nirvana, if you like,
Mm,
when it comes to employment. So don't be put off by little bits of a job that aren't, and learn to either at least not complain about it, but learn ways to make it better and more enjoyable. Um, and look, I think if you're heading out into the wide world, you need to, one is work and engage with people within your industry or what have you, and
mm,
get a few ideas about what's possible. And look, I think that younger people have more opportunities than us. Look, there's all this technology and AI and all this stuff that's heading our way that is actually going to revolutionize life on our planet, and it's going to revolutionize the
mm,
work environment. And I think there's some almost getting to a point, if you can imagine it, it will almost, you can make it happen through some of this stuff. So there's some really great opportunities out there that wouldn't even been thought about 10 years
mm,
ago, let alone
exactly.
when I was at high school.
Mm,
So um, don't be put off by the next generation saying, "Oh, that
mm,
that's not possible. You can't do that or whatever," because um, I've been there and got past that. The next generation saying, "No, you can't do that" or whatever. So I think also you've got to be pragmatic and
mm,
don't become so ideologue. Don't become an ideologue where only your way is the way to solve a problem. Because
only always the highway.
yeah, I think you need to be open-minded about stuff, because if you're not open-minded, then progress doesn't happen, I don't think.
Mm,
What else would I say? I really am a big fan of travel, getting out and seeing parts of the world, just to give you an appreciation of where you came from, an
mm,
appreciation of what your family and parents, etc., did for you, and an appreciation of how things are done differently in other parts of the world.
mm,
Um, and if you come from New Zealand or Australia, really, or New Zealand anyway. I mean, New Zealand was first settled about 1200 by the year 1200 by the indigenous population, the Maori. And Europe, I can remember when I was over there, I was sitting in a pub that was um, built in, I think, 900, the year
mm.
900. And it's,
So the,
every 5 years they put a new thatch on the roof or whatever. I was thinking, oh my God, there was people sitting in this pub having a beer before there was anybody set foot in New Zealand.
mm.
All
It's
those
just
sorts of
crazy the
things are
amount of
quite
history that
amazing.
Europe has.
Yeah,
And it's
yeah,
something that we don't have here. Like I've heard a lot of Europeans come to Australia and New Zealand, and they'll be like, "Oh wow, your countries are so modern. The buildings you have are so
yeah.
architecturally modern." But sometimes going back to the past and seeing buildings that were built over 1,000 years ago is really really cool to see and really interesting to see because we don't have it here. Like oldest buildings in Melbourne, for example, would be maximum 200 years old, 300 years
Yeah,
old, and they've got thousands of those buildings in Europe
yeah,
in
I
certain
know.
countries.
And it cracks me up. I don't know what it's like in Australia, but here we have each town seems to have its own heritage group that want this building and that building protected for heritage status. And you look at it and you think, well, it's not even 100 years old. It's not that flash. I mean,
Mm.
why would you bother? It's particularly after being to Europe, where, as you say, there's all these buildings that are so old.
It really is.
Mm.
So it's
So that would
it's
be my advice. Just
yeah.
those things. And travel really does broaden the horizons.
It really does, yeah. So,
Mm.
those are actually all our questions then for you, Miles. I do really appreciate you coming on the podcast, actually for nearly 2 hours and speaking to us about, your career before politics, a bit about your farming life, some things that you and some advice you'd give to students in 2024, especially around traveling around the world and experiencing different cultures. So, thank you again for coming on the podcast and being the first actual Kiwi politician to come on and speak to us. We do really appreciate it.
No worries, mate.